Buenos días y bienvenidos a esta tercera sesión de la iniciativa que organizamos conjuntamente el Real Instituto Elcano y Fundación Naturi sobre las sendas geopolíticas de la transición energética, que pretende ser crear un marco de reflexión, de debate sobre la transición energética, enfocándonos en distintas áreas del mundo. Empezamos el primer año con Oriente Medio y su proceso de transición energética. El año pasado, tras la aprobación por parte de Estados Unidos del IRA, miramos hacia el Atlántico y en esta ocasión volvemos a mirar a Oriente, en este caso para tratar la zona del Mediterráneo oriental. Bueno, para esta sesión que celebramos conjuntamente Real Instituto Elcano y Fundación Naturi y celebramos en un formato híbrido con personas en la sala y con personas conectadas online, con casi 600 personas registradas para atender la sesión, tenemos la fortuna de contar para la apertura con José Juan Díaz, presidente del Real Instituto Elcano, y con Rafael Villaseca, presidente de Fundación Naturi, a quien cedo ya la palabra. Rafael.
Gracias, Manuel. Muy buenos días. Y muchas gracias a todos por su asistencia, tanto presencialmente como online. Permítame que recuerde, seguro que lo saben, pero me agradaría recordarlo, cuáles son los objetivos de la Fundación Naturi. Básicamente, nuestras actividades, nuestros presupuestos, van dirigidos a dos cosas. La primera es actividades sociales, que quizá ustedes conozcan, de las que nos sentimos orgullosos, ya que, como digo, más o menos dedicamos la mitad de nuestro presupuesto y de nuestras actividades. Y la segunda, en donde se centraría nuestra reunión del día de hoy, es a promover y desarrollar actividades que tengan como objetivo promocionar notas, estudios, libros, seminarios, conferencias, que traten de dar datos y opiniones objetivas y fundadas sobre la situación del sector energético. Creemos que, más que nunca, en ese sector, siempre complejo, es necesario aportar la luz que buena y modestamente podamos aportar para que se puedan tomar las mejores decisiones en este cambiante mundo de la energía, mucho más cuando tenemos que afrontar el fundamental reto de la transición energética. Ahí dedicamos también la mitad de nuestros esfuerzos y de nuestros dineros y uno de estos temas se concreta en los temas geoestratégicos. La razón no puede ser más obvia y seguro que está más que presente en todos nosotros. Históricamente ha sido así, la geoestrategia ha estado ligada a la energía desde tiempos inmemoriales, pero no hay ninguna duda de que de la mano de la globalización y de las consecuencias de la transición energética y de diversas crisis políticas está más presente que nunca. Cuando nos planteamos tratar este tema con rigor y con seriedad, no podíamos tener mejor objetivo que contar con la colaboración de entidades expertas, conocedoras de este mundo y que tuvieran el interés de colaborar con nosotros en esta iniciativa. Y debo agradecer al Real Instituto Elcano y a su presidente aquí presente que entendieron perfectamente este interés y colaboraron con nosotros ya en esta tercera sesión para organizar jornadas que pudieran efectivamente arrojar luz, datos e interés sobre la geoestrategia y la energía. Hablar de geoestrategia y energía es hoy un tema totalmente vigente, totalmente presente en las actividades políticas, en las actividades empresariales, en las perspectivas económicas. Y no puede ser de otra manera. Y el tema que hoy nos ocupa pues no puede estar más candente. La situación es clave. Sin duda alguna, la transición energética, cuando finalice, alterará los equilibrios y las situaciones, por cuanto tanto sus orígenes como su distribución va a tener unos parámetros distintos, pero no hay ninguna duda que durante bastantes años aún estaremos teniendo que tener muy presente cuáles son las actuales situaciones mediante las cuales la energía nos llega a nuestros mercados, normalmente con origen de hidrocarburo y con una gran probabilidad orígenes en esa zona que vamos a analizar. Por lo tanto, tener bien presente esta situación, saber cuáles son sus condicionantes va a ser determinante porque han ocasionado en el pasado, y no podemos desgraciadamente descartar que lo hagan en un futuro, crisis puntuales, serias y que han trastocado de una manera importante planes económicos, empresariales y en muchas ocasiones también políticos. Por eso es una enorme satisfacción poderles presentar hoy, sin duda alguna, de la mano y con la dirección del Real Instituto Elcano, esta jornada que pretende entrar en profundidad en qué sucede en el Mediterráneo oriental en esos momentos, qué podemos esperar y cuáles son los retos principales que debemos abordar aquí y ahora con esta situación tan compleja dentro del ya muy complejo mundo de la energía. Por eso repito las gracias a todos los que van a participar hoy, a los ponentes y sin duda alguna a Gonzalo, que va a dirigir esas sesiones, y repetir mi agradecimiento al presidente del Real Instituto Elcano por el apoyo que siempre nos brinda para poder organizar conjuntamente esta jornada. Nada más y gracias a todos ustedes. Cedo la palabra a Juan José.
Muchas gracias, Rafael. Es un auténtico placer y un honor estar en estas jornadas hoy aquí. Naturgy es uno de los patronos esenciales del Real Instituto Elcano, y los patronos en Elcano no solo nos aportan la financiación para generar el bien público que tratamos de producir desde Elcano, nos aportan sobre todo las preguntas. Y en un mundo de incertidumbres, en un mundo de riesgos, en un mundo de enormes cambios, tener las preguntas correctas es el primer paso para poder hacer una buena investigación. Así que estamos muy contentos, muy satisfechos por haberles tenido incentivándonos y hablando con nuestros equipos para tener esta reunión. Y por supuesto, muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes, a los que están detrás de las pantallas, y a las personas, a los ponentes y al equipo del Elcano, a Gonzalo, a Lara, a Ignacio, que han podido hacer esta convocatoria posible. Que creo que ya es el segundo o tercer año que hacemos. Yo creo que uno de los temas que probablemente para enmarcar estos paneles de hoy en día, uno de los temas que a mí me gustaría enmarcar es que aunque existe un mundo hiperbólico y todo es nuevo, todo es histórico, todo es un nuevo orden, un gran riesgo, un gran reto para nuestra convivencia, probablemente la energía sí que sea uno de los grandes retos del futuro de la humanidad, del futuro de nuestra civilización, y es sin duda alguna uno de los elementos que va a condicionar qué es y cómo vamos a ser en los próximos 20, 50, 100 años. Y esto se debe fundamentalmente, en mi opinión, a muy grandes trazos, a la interactuación de tres grandes ejes. Por un lado, tenemos la lucha contra el cambio climático. El cambio climático es antropocénico, lo sabemos, y tenemos que luchar contra él. El segundo de los ejes importantes, en mi opinión, es que tenemos una situación energética nueva, una situación energética en la que han aparecido nuevas fuentes de energía, unas que crecerán, otras no crecerán, que están compitiendo entre sí y que están alimentadas por una tecnología que se desarrolla de una manera muy rápida, no solo en la generación, sino también en la mitigación de los impactos que las emisiones tienen sobre el objetivo del cambio climático. Y la tercera de las circunstancias, que a veces es menos apreciada, pero que va a tener un enorme impacto sobre nuestro futuro, es que en este nuevo orden energético que va a ocurrir, o que va a aparecer, o que vamos a ir construyendo, por decirlo de una forma más precisa, el grado de intervención del Estado va a ser mucho más elevado que el que hemos tenido en el pasado. De forma que esa trilogía de factores probablemente es algo en lo que nos define un entorno de actuaciones, una urgencia también temporal, y es algo que va a condicionar cómo nos podemos mover. Hay una tercera pata o un segundo nivel del análisis de esa interacción de la trilogía, que en mi opinión es que el nuevo orden mundial no aparece de la nada. Ha habido un viejo orden mundial de la energía, y la diplomacia de la vieja energía y la diplomacia de la nueva energía van a tener y van a interactuar y van a crear situaciones de conflicto y probablemente también de cooperación. No hay por qué ser exclusivamente pesimista. Y yo creo que de esa interacción entre lo viejo y lo nuevo es algo en el que hay que estar muy atento, porque si la historia nos sirve de precedente, la antigua diplomacia del petróleo, por decirlo de alguna manera, tiene los recursos, tiene la capacidad, tiene el recurso básico que es la energía, y va a interactuar con las nuevas diplomacias. Y yo creo que esto es algo que deberíamos también tener en cuenta y analizar de una forma constante. El último punto, para bajarlo ya a lo que probablemente hoy hablaremos aquí, es que la situación de España en ese problema, en cada uno de ellos, es distinta, pero tenemos algo que nos condiciona, que es la geografía. Y la geografía de la energía es global, pero también es una energía regional. Y nosotros estamos inmersos en una situación, primero, no solo con los Estados, sino con la Unión Europea, que actúa en cada uno de los tres ejes iniciales que he mencionado, y estamos en una geografía de la energía particularmente complicada. Y esto nos vuelve a traer esa nueva o esa antigua trilogía que hemos estado pensando desde hace ya décadas sobre la necesidad de tener energías limpias, tener precios competitivos de la energía y tener garantía de suministro. Hay demasiados triángulos en esta ecuación como para poderlo resumir en una primera aproximación. Es lo que esperamos que vayan a hacer nuestros ponentes, estamos seguros que lo van a hacer. Pero si quieren pensar en dónde están los aspectos geográficos, geoestratégicos, de esta situación, tienen que introducir la geografía, tienen que introducir el objetivo de suficiencia, sostenimiento, energías sostenibles, y garantía de suministro, y tienen que introducir en el mapa también vieja diplomacia, nueva diplomacia, y ese otro triángulo que estaría entre reducción de emisiones, por otro lado, el tema importante del aumento de la intervención del Estado, de la regulación, que creo que va a ser muy determinante, y la interacción del tiempo que se nos está acabando. Yo no soy particularmente pesimista sobre la transición, creo que estamos aprendiendo mucho, a lo mejor deberíamos haber aprendido antes, pero mi percepción es que se pueden aunar, aunque parezca hoy difícil, las fuerzas que están, porque algunas se compensan con otras. No todo siempre es malo todo el tiempo, de la misma manera que no siempre todo es bueno todo el tiempo. Y algunos de los problemas que generan estas fricciones creo que nos van a dar oportunidades para que empresas capaces, eficientes, con visión, con tecnología, puedan ayudarnos a resolver este tema que, como en todas las civilizaciones de la historia, el tener esa energía que necesitamos es la clave del desarrollo y del crecimiento y de la estabilidad y de la paz. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, José Juan Ruiz. Pedir disculpas porque creo que antes cometí un error con el apellido. Y Rafael Villaseca, realmente esperamos tener un debate muy rico, interesante, y entender un poco mejor lo que está pasando en la zona, especialmente desde el punto de vista energético. Es verdad que, como se comentaba, pues se puede tratar de un área que además se puede convertir en un nexo de alguna manera entre Europa y entre Oriente, no solo en lo relativo a los combustibles fósiles, que seguro que hoy trataremos aquí, sino también en lo relativo a las energías renovables y a las conexiones de distintas infraestructuras. Bueno, para empezar la sesión tenemos hoy la fortuna de contar con nosotros, en primer lugar, con Ana Palacio. Bueno, presentar a Ana Palacio es una tarea casi imposible, teniendo en cuenta todo su bagaje profesional. Ha ocupado distintos cargos públicos, entre los que yo destacaría su cargo como ministra de Asuntos Exteriores de España, su vicepresidencia del Banco Mundial o la Secretaría General de CIADI. Trabaja principalmente en el campo energético, en el que es miembro de los consejos de administración de diversas empresas en el ámbito privado y forma parte de varios comités consultivos internacionales. Fundadora del despacho Palacio y Asociados, su conocimiento sobre la geoestrategia y geopolítica, derecho internacional y europeo es enorme, y conocer tu visión sobre la zona, especialmente en lo relativo al sector energético, si es que se puede disociar de alguna manera, pues es un privilegio. Muchas gracias, Ana, por aceptar la invitación por parte del Real Instituto Elcano y Fundación Naturgy. Y para conversar con ella, porque de alguna manera este es el formato que hemos elegido, ¿no?, para esta primera sesión, un diálogo con Ana Palacio. Como es habitual en estas sesiones, contamos con Gonzalo Escribano, director del Programa de Energía y Clima del Real Instituto Elcano, un verdadero experto también en la materia. Es para nosotros también un lujo contar contigo, Gonzalo. Por mi parte nada más, y os cedo la palabra.
Pues muchas gracias, Manuel, muchas gracias a la Fundación Naturgy y a todo su fantástico equipo por permitir que estemos ahí hoy todos reunidos. Y muchas gracias, Ana, por hacer hueco en tu apretadísima agenda. Para mí es un gran honor tener esta oportunidad de conversar contigo, porque para mí es un privilegio hacerlo con la primera ministra de Asuntos Exteriores que hemos tenido en España, y creo que esto es una cosa muy valiosa. No voy a perder más tiempo en glosar tu fantástico currículum, así que, querida Ana, tenemos, como comentábamos el otro día, lamentablemente tenemos un momento geopolítico apasionante, ¿no? Ha sido bastante bien introducido en la inauguración y no me voy a extender más sobre ello, pero en la propia Europa, Ucrania, Rusia, nuestra rivalidad con China creciente y extendiéndose a las cadenas descarbonizadas y, por supuesto, y como siempre, no podía estar ausente nunca, todos los años, Oriente Medio y, en el caso que nos ocupa, pues el Mediterráneo Oriental, y está en la mente de todos lo que está ocurriendo ahora mismo en la región, en distintos países y en conjunto en toda la región. Yo lo que te preguntaría es, teniendo en cuenta este contexto geopolítico, y que además en muchas democracias vamos a tener, ¿no?, Estados Unidos, el Parlamento Europeo, la India, otros, ¿no? No siempre hay que mirar exclusivamente a nuestro ombligo, me gustaría empezar preguntándote cómo ves el paisaje geopolítico global actual. ¿Cuáles crees que van a ser los principales vectores que van a impulsar su evolución? Y esa evolución, ¿hacia dónde crees que nos llega? Sé que son tres preguntas sencillas que tú nos vas a poder resumir brevemente.
Y sobre todo que hay que hacerlo con una economía del tiempo. Bueno, aunque el tiempo es es un bien escaso en estas situaciones, yo quiero empezar a dar las gracias, y no es retórica, para mí es un honor, o sea, vamos a ser claros, para mí es un honor estar aquí. Es un honor el comprobar que las empresas españolas, y en particular Naturgy, cuya trayectoria conozco y cuya trayectoria señala muy bien esta participación de la empresa y este entendimiento de la empresa de lo que son los retos actuales. Y por supuesto Elcano, y por supuesto Gonzalo, con quien estábamos la semana pasada los dos escuchando las reflexiones de la Comisión Europea y de los grandes think tanks que ayudan a la Comisión Europea a pensar lo que va a ser el próximo mandato, la próxima Comisión, cuáles van a ser las políticas en esta etapa que podríamos llamar del Green Deal segunda parte, por no empezar si es 2.0 o 2. ¿qué? Y allí estuvimos todo el día. Y por supuesto hay que tomar distancia. Y al hilo de lo que decía Rafael Villaseca y lo que decía José Juan Ruiz, yo creo que hay unos cuantos hitos que tenemos que tener en la cabeza para entender la geopolítica hoy. Por supuesto, la guerra de Ucrania, la invasión total de Ucrania que puso en solfa todo lo que eran los precarios en muchos casos, pero lo que era la situación, y sobre todo nos llevó a la conciencia de los europeos una sensación de inseguridad que para nosotros es nueva, de que realmente la evolución, la construcción europea se ha hecho en esa idea de los dividendos de la paz, y partiendo de que la paz era un punto de arranque de todo esto. Hitos. Por citar unos cuantos, creo que hoy no podemos dejar de citar 2001, la entrada de China en la OMC, porque ¿qué es lo que nos estamos encontrando nosotros? Y en España somos bien conscientes de ello. Se ha hecho una apuesta por las nuevas tecnologías en los ámbitos renovables, y esa apuesta hoy nos crea una dependencia, y una dependencia de mercado, una dependencia de relaciones internacionales, una dependencia a través de China, y por lo tanto yo creo que ese 2001, ¿y por qué digo el hito? Porque ese planteamiento optimista que yo comparto, optimista que es realista, realmente hay que negociar con China su nueva participación en lo que es el acceso a las cadenas de valor, a las cadenas de suministro, en las que ha hecho que ha tenido un magnífico resultado, pero que en estos momentos nos amenazan a la Unión Europea porque nos crean una dependencia, que hemos salido del gas ruso, estamos intentando salir del gas ruso y nos crea una dependencia en algunos aspectos del 100% de elementos o componentes esenciales de lo que es la tecnología solar y de lo que es la tecnología de viento. Ahora, primero, evidentemente, hablando de Oriente Medio, no podemos orillar 2003, Irak, eso está ahí. No es momento, ayer me pedían un análisis de lo que fue la postura española. Lo que fue la postura española es estar al lado de un aliado fundamental en situación de necesidad, en una idea, en un momento en el que lo que se debate en el mundo es si Europa va a ser counterpower, counterweight, y estoy citando counterweight of the United States, en un mundo que no se ve la amenaza de Rusia, o por lo menos que no la ven algunos. Por supuesto, nuestros estados, nuevos estados miembros que se incorporaron en 2004, sí, y como la vieron otros. Pero eso está ahí porque eso ha creado en un mundo en el que la percepción es casi más importante que la realidad, desde luego ha creado una percepción que va más allá de Estados Unidos, que va a Occidente, y no lo podemos dejar de lado. Yo creo que el otro punto, evidentemente, podemos decir que son las crisis económicas, en donde el modelo que se entiende que desarrollo tiene que ser con el modelo occidental y de alguna manera eso lleva a un pluralismo y lleva eventualmente a una democracia, se rompe completamente. Ahí yo cito más que esa idea, que no puedes ponerle una fecha, la inauguración de los Juegos Olímpicos en Pekín, donde vimos esa explosión de lo que era un modelo alternativo, que ahí se presentó. ¿Quién lo presenta, por cierto? Que es muy interesante. ¿Quién lleva esos Juegos Olímpicos? Un señor llamado Xi Jinping, que estaba en la escalada de los puestos. Punto tercero, 2013, Xi Jinping, la ruta de la seda. Esos son los datos que tenemos que tener en la mente cuando vemos la situación geopolítica actual. Y la situación geopolítica actual tiene, pues, lo sabemos todos, lo ha dicho José Juan y lo ha dicho Villaseca, tenemos la idea de que hay una rivalidad Estados Unidos-China, una China que está jugando, por cierto, si hablamos de Oriente Medio, positivamente en cuanto fue China quien armó la reconciliación entre Irán y Arabia Saudí, cosa que es muy notable, pero que no se acaba de ver cuál va a ser su posición en aquello de 2005 del Deputy Secretary of State, que les dice: ustedes ya tienen que asumir las responsabilidades de gran potencia, 2005. Y estamos ahí, con foco en Oriente Medio, por supuesto, y por supuesto tenemos Gaza detrás, pero tenemos también todo lo que se está moviendo ahí de Turquía. Tenemos que hablar de Turquía, tenemos que hablar de las dependencias. Eso es el panorama que a mi modo de ver es fundamental, más allá, como digo, de la guerra de Ucrania, que para nosotros, europeos, para nosotros occidentales, nos lleva a un mundo pues en donde tenemos la sensación de inseguridad. Eso en el resto del mundo no se ve así. Voy a decir otra cosa que creo que tenemos que tener en cuenta. Evidentemente la transición energética es la guía, evidentemente. Ahora, tengamos en cuenta que hay mucho mundo, China es parte de ese mundo, Pakistán es parte de ese mundo, toda África es parte de ese mundo, con sociedades que crecen, si no exponencialmente, que están creciendo mucho en términos de población y que evidentemente necesitan energía. O sea que el acceso a energía en muchas partes de África, tenemos 800 millones de africanos que no están electrificados, de subsaharianos, empezando por ahí. Pero en términos generales, tenemos que entender que la transición energética, por supuesto, pero tenemos que entender que hay situaciones. Pakistán fue un buen ejemplo cuando dijo: mire usted, yo tengo que tirar de carbón, lignito, tiro de carbón y lignito. Por cierto, Alemania ha hecho lo mismo. O sea que tenemos que ser realistas en lo que en nuestro mensaje al mundo. Yo creo que desde el punto de vista energético podemos partir de eso, si te parece.
Pues me parece un buen punto de partida. Yo te diría que dimos un siguiente paso para llegar a Europa, ¿no? Acabas de publicar un artículo muy interesante que has titulado, cito de memoria, Las verdades incómodas energéticas para la Unión Europea, ¿no?
Pues yo decía perspectivas, que yo no quiero decir solo cosas negativas. Y perspectivas, sí, vamos a ver, la Unión Europea es ese producto más acabado de lo que es el orden internacional basado en reglas que hoy está en tela de juicio, clarísimamente. El disruptor es Rusia, el que juega de zaguero es China. Y a partir de ahí lo que hemos visto es que el llamado sur global, pues no voy a decir que esté en contra, pero desde luego quiere tener una participación que hasta ahora no ha tenido. Con esos mimbres, nosotros europeos tenemos que entender que nosotros somos en derecho, por derecho, con derecho, en fin, que nuestro marco es el tratado. Y lo primero que cuando se habla de energía, yo siempre recuerdo es, el tratado tiene una situación complicada en el mundo de energía. El mix energético, es decir, la seguridad energética depende exclusivamente de los Estados miembros. La lucha contra el cambio climático, la sostenibilidad, el medio ambiente depende exclusivamente de la Comisión Europea. Y ese desequilibrio que se produce en tantas situaciones lo intentó mediar el Green Deal, con una base que era entendible en 2019. En fin, la seguridad energética para Europa está ahí, están creciendo nuestra autonomía energética a través de las renovables, y aquí lo que hay es que, lo decía José Juan Ruiz, digamos que hay una vuelta del Estado, y una vuelta del Estado que la vemos en muchos ámbitos, y evidentemente hoy aquí no voy a empezar a desglosarlos porque está presente. Pero esa vuelta del Estado desde Europa es una vuelta del Estado regulatoria, y se hace a través del medio ambiente, a través del Green Deal. ¿Qué pasa con el Green Deal? Pues claro que cuando falla la base sobre la que se había construido, que es que se daba por supuesto que había energía, se daba por supuesto la seguridad energética, ahí que nos creó una situación de desequilibrio total. Que yo voy a decir que el Green Deal ha tenido, yo siempre digo, el mayor éxito del Green Deal es realmente haber servido de marco para reaccionar rápido en un momento en el que se hunde la dependencia de gas de que tiene sobre todo Alemania, pero que tiene Europa, la dependencia del gas ruso se hunde, y entonces paradójicamente el Green Deal sirve de armazón. No voy a decir que no estaba para nada en los objetivos del Green Deal, pero el Green Deal había empezado a hacer que los europeos hablaran juntos y buscaran juntos soluciones al cambio climático, a la sostenibilidad, pero que eran soluciones que tenían que ver con el mix. Algunas muy criticables, como el inicial exclusión de la energía nuclear de la taxonomía que plantea Bruselas, que luego hace que tengan que pivotar y meterla por la puerta de atrás. Pero incluso para discutir es bueno que no hubiera... Cada Estado hasta entonces era muy autónomo en los temas de mix, en los temas de seguridad energética. Y eso fuerza y da un marco. Y, en fin, es verdad, y ayer lo hablábamos, es verdad que además en esta vida hay que tener suerte, pero eso ya lo decía Napoleón de sus generales, pero tiene suerte. Bueno, pues Europa tuvo suerte y tuvo circunstancias, empezando por un invierno suave que le llevaron. Pero si vemos ahí, y es lo último que quiero decir de esto, el Green Deal había tenido un efecto extraordinariamente negativo, y es que Europa no había renovado los contratos, en muchos casos los contratos a largo plazo de suministros, en particular de suministros del LNG. Y eso, al final, a mí me contaban, y esto es algo más reciente, pero es 2020-2021, una visita a un determinado país productor de Ursula von der Leyen, y me contaba el ministro, y me decía, mire, hablamos, todo muy bien, Europa tiene interés en importar nuestro gas y tal. Entonces empezamos a ver, bueno, contratos. Y me dice, no, 5 años, porque claro, ese comienzo de la desestabilización de los mercados de gas que precede a la invasión total de Rusia, de Ucrania, se debe a que realmente no se ha invertido, digamos que los contratos a largo plazo se han dejado y ahí hay un problema digamos, de inversiones upstream que son absolutamente necesarios. Yo creo que ahora cuando vemos que Total negocia, ayer se decía con Oman, una planta 1.000 millones de inversión, donde efectivamente la energía de esa planta va a ser solar, la que consume la planta va a ser solar, pero que está pensado para exportar LNG a Francia. Francia, lo vamos a dejar de lado, tiene problemas con su flota nuclear actual, o ha dicho que va a entrar en un programa, pero una planta nuclear no se hace y encima nos faltan, y eso es algo que Europa tiene que tener en cuenta, nos faltan capacidades, nos faltan ingenieros, nos faltan soldadores, nos faltan esas capacidades que necesitamos. Eso yo diría que es las verdades incómodas. Las verdades incómodas, la última que menciono, es lo que dice Letta en su estudio, dice: tenemos un problema, es que no hay mercado interior en 3 ámbitos fundamentales, tiene toda la razón, que son fundamentales y en donde todavía se han considerado, estoy parafraseando, pero creo que es la cita exacta, se han considerado demasiado estratégicos por los Estados miembros. Finanzas, lo que es la digitalización, o más bien las teleco, pero sobre todo energía. Sobre todo energía. En España, con los Pirineos, sabemos algo de eso. Necesitamos crear esa vertebración europea que hemos hecho con las redes de transporte, pero que no hemos hecho con las redes de energía. Último tema, para el futuro. Este debate que hay sobre las redes de hidrógeno. Yo comprendo que en estos momentos se ven las redes de hidrógeno, se ven todas las dificultades, pero ojo, cuando empezábamos a hablar de solar, veíamos dificultades muchas también, y hoy solar es lo más barato que produce en el mercado. Pero lo que está claro es que, para mí, estratégicamente, esa sería la primera red energética que nace europea. Y creo que eso hay que tenerlo en cuenta. Estamos en una situación complicada, además económicamente, tenemos un montón de cosas, pero en fin, ahí andamos.
Ana, sé que has estado recientemente por la región que nos ocupa, has mencionado antes Turquía, no sé si quieres compartir con nosotros alguna reflexión al respecto.
Vamos a ver, yo voy a empezar diciendo algo que me parece de justicia. La COP de Dubái fue un grandísimo éxito. Yo recuerdo unas reuniones pre-COP coincidiendo con la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas en septiembre anterior, y recuerdo una frase que se me quedó, que había uno indignado, que dijo: pero ¿cómo no se puede? Al secretario general: es que usted no se da cuenta que está poniendo al zorro a cuidar a las gallinas. O sea, que aquí tenemos, el zorro serían las petroleras, las gallinas pues serían las renovables. Y no es eso. Yo creo que esta COP ha traído sentido común, ha traído realismo. La transición energética, en nuestro caso, que realmente es una transición energética, se va a hacer. La preocupación por una energía limpia existe incluso en países como China, que están construyendo centrales de carbón, como India, que a mí el ministro Rakesh, que era entonces el ministro, me decía: mire, señora Palacio, yo quemaré lo que tenga. Lignito nuestro es muy malo, lo voy a quemar. ¿Por qué? Porque yo comparto con ustedes. Miren, el desarreglo de los monzones para nosotros es algo terrible, pero antes del desarreglo de los monzones yo no tengo otra que electrificar. Y para electrificar tengo que quemar. ¿Y qué es lo que puedo quemar? Lo que pueda, lo quemaré. Sin perjuicio de que también estemos y eso, el mejor ejemplo es China, que va a construir más renovables que el resto unido, a la vez que ha lanzado un programa nuclear ambiciosísimo, a la vez que siguen construyendo plantas de gas, porque su compromiso, que es muy interesante, y esto es de Glasgow, era no financiar plantas de carbón fuera de China, que es muy interesante. Fuera de China, pero en China hacemos lo que nos parece. Yo eso lo destacaría en primer lugar hablando de energía. Por supuesto, ¿qué tenemos ahora? Pues el problema de los choke points, pero que es un problema en sí, que tenemos una inseguridad de qué va a pasar. ¿Qué va a pasar en el estrecho de Hormuz? ¿Va a haber ahí un desequilibrio? Pues verdaderamente, tal como está la cuestión entre Irán, tenemos que aguantar la respiración. Hasta el momento, yo creo que ha sido bastante notable que no haya habido grandes perturbaciones. Luego tenemos el Suez. Y Suez es la otra cuestión que además tiene una repercusión sobre la región, y es que Egipto está en una situación muy complicada. Digamos que los ingresos de Suez son fundamentales, y Egipto es una pieza fundamental para la estabilidad de la región. Ya que, de nuevo, se ha dicho antes, creo que lo ha dicho José Juan, la energía está imbricada en la geopolítica. Claro, ahí tenemos otra cuestión que tiene que ver con la energía, que es el abandono de Estados Unidos de la región. Estados Unidos se fue de la región. Se fue por muchas razones, pero la primera de que no haya tanta presencia en la región de Estados Unidos es que ya no dependen, que es que ahora Estados Unidos es el primer exportador de LNG, es el primer exportador incluso de petróleo, y con una otra incógnita. ¿Qué va a pasar? ¿Va a predominar después de las elecciones, o va a prevalecer después de las elecciones, la actitud de Biden de haber cortado los permisos de terminales LNG, como estamos ahora? ¿Qué va a pasar ahí? ¿O va a entrar Trump diciendo drill, baby drill, y eso qué repercusiones va a tener? Pues verdaderamente la ecuación es complicada, y si volvemos a la Unión Europea, yo creo que tenemos un nuevo periodo con unas elecciones al Parlamento Europeo que todavía no podemos especular, pero que van a cambiar un malestar. Yo decía en ese artículo que, de la misma manera que la opinión pública europea estuvo muy detrás del Green Deal, muy detrás de esa idea de que Europa ha sido siempre abanderada de este movimiento de tomar en cuenta el cambio climático, siempre ha sido abanderada, tenía que seguir siendo abanderada. No entramos a discutir lo que es nuestro poder regulatorio, que existe, el efecto Bruselas existe, pero en fin, digamos que en este nuevo mundo en el que lamentablemente el orden internacional basado en reglas, empezando por la OMC, se debilita. Termino con esto. Tenemos una situación más complicada. La Unión Europea va a seguir en la senda. No tiene ningún sentido, ni creo que tenga soporte el dar una vuelta, como algunos amenazan, una vuelta de 180 grados. Pero evidentemente la Unión Europea va a tener en cuenta las protestas de los agricultores, y una cuestión fundamental es que la Unión Europea necesita competitividad, y que las empresas padecen estos rigores regulatorios, esta complejidad regulatoria, estas dificultades de red tape, y encima, claro, estamos en un mundo en donde China subvenciona, son empresas de Estado que no juegan con las mismas reglas, y Estados Unidos se ha planteado subvencionar para estar a la cabeza de lo que consideren las tecnologías de energía punteras que van a determinar el mundo. Ahí estoy con José Juan Ruiz. El mundo va a venir determinado por las tecnologías, por las green tech, por las tecnologías de energía.
Miraba mi reloj porque no quería quedarme sin tiempo sin tener ocasión de hablar de España, ¿no? Me gustaría preguntarte muy concreto, ¿no? ¿Qué lugar crees que juega España en este panorama que has diseñado, y cuáles son las ventajas comparativas geopolíticas de España en esta transición?
Vamos a ver, yo creo que España en energía ha dado un ejemplo que ojalá lo diéramos en muchas otras cosas, que es que ha habido una política de Estado. Cuando lee uno a veces que hay unas políticas energéticas que son las renovables, son de izquierdas, y otras como el nuclear, que es de derecha, y dices, mire, entérese, el gran programa de renovables lo lanza el primer gobierno del partido. Nemesio Fernández Cuesta es nuestro gran pope de esta situación. O sea que ha habido una apuesta que viene determinada por la geografía, y vuelvo a algo que se ha dicho, viene determinada por los Pirineos. Nosotros conocemos muy bien a nuestro vecino no quería un mercado integrado europeo, probablemente sea una de las razones por las cuales no se han integrado estas redes energéticas, y entonces España apuesta por el LNG, y verdaderamente ahí hicimos una apuesta que ha demostrado que lo que se haya criticado a veces, y que te podemos ver la historia de por qué cada cual quería tener su LNG cerca, pero lo que ha demostrado es que estaba bien hecho, que en un momento de crisis no solo España no ha tenido problemas de abastecimiento, y esto sabe Naturgy un montón, sino que además hemos sido cruciales para que, en particular Francia, a quien le coincidió con las dificultades de la mitad de su flota nuclear, tuviera electricidad y tuviera gas. O sea, hemos exportado a tope en unas conexiones que son, en fin, tacañas, pero que las hemos utilizado al máximo y que ha demostrado el bien fundado. Con lo cual, en España, primera cosa que tenemos es que hay un consenso que digamos que tenemos que llegar a un acuerdo sobre el nuclear, y yo ahí, en mi pasado, entre las muchas cosas que he hecho, yo he sido miembro de la Comisión Ejecutiva y vicepresidenta para el mundo de Areva, que es por eso tengo esos reflejos de haber negociado con China, haber negociado con India. Nosotros tiene todo el sentido de mantener las nucleares mientras podamos, operativas. Meternos en un programa nuclear, francamente, no tiene en estos momentos para España ningún sentido. Ahora, que sepamos todos que o decimos que queremos mantener las nucleares pronto, o eso se va, porque una nuclear no es que des a un piloto enciendas, o sea que no es gas, no tiene la facilidad de gas. Todo eso es el panorama que nosotros tenemos. Luego España ha tenido, y presidencia española y la presencia de España en la COP, pues han tenido un papel muy importante. Voy a decir que yo coincido con todo. A mí yo es que soy más realista que dogmática, pero bueno, a veces el dogma también es importante. Creo que hay que llegar. Ahora yo creo que lo que Europa está reflexionando y metiendo mucho más realismo, obligada por las circunstancias en esta situación. Con lo cual, nosotros hemos jugado un papel importante en la construcción europea desde que formamos parte de ella. Desde luego en este ámbito hemos estado ahí, hemos estado desde hace tiempo, y vuelvo a decir del histórico de la apuesta por las renovables, y tiene todo el sentido que sigamos, vuelvo a decir, apostando. España es una de las primeras apuestas de una red troncal de hidrógeno, que no es de España, o sea que digamos que hay 2030 es un proyecto europeo, y que ahí está España, como estuvo en la solar, como estuvo en cabeza, digamos que en línea frontal, y lo que hay es que esperar que todo eso se combine con que sabemos que el gas todavía no es necesario. O sea, esa idea de que en 5 años vamos a prescindir del gas y de no renovar los contratos, ya vemos lo que está haciendo Puyanet, por citar una cosa que fue de ayer y que no es de España. Eso va a ser una transición muchísimo más larga, precisamente porque, hombre, por mucho que sepamos almacenamiento de las energías intermitentes, y por mucho que en España tenemos bombeo muy importante, pero eso no está, con lo cual, en fin, no echemos a las tinieblas exteriores al gas, no entendamos que el petróleo no solo es para hacer electricidad, que el petróleo está y para transportar. No es que el petróleo está en nuestras vidas, no estas gafas no, que creo que son metálicas, pero en fin, que está en nuestras vidas en todas partes. Y que la alternativa, cuando a mí, antes lo hablábamos, cuando a mí me dicen, no, porque hay modelización, Europa tiene que decrecer. Y bueno, a ver, ¿por dónde empezamos a decrecer? A ver, ¿en qué decrecemos? Volvemos a una sanidad, no sé, podemos ir a una sanidad de los años 50, eso no sería decrecer, o vamos a no encender las luces, ¿qué es por dónde decrecemos? Yo, por lo tanto, creo que España, como siempre, tiene un papel, y en este ámbito, desde luego, un papel clarísimo, y lo que yo diría en las posturas de España ahora, un poquito más de realismo. Dogmatismo está bien, pero un poquito más de realismo. Y eso era mi artículo del otro día.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Ana. En lo que no podemos decrecer es en tiempo, hemos cumplido, así que muchas gracias por estar. Hemos cumplido muy time efficient, ¿no? Muy eficientes en el tiempo.
Muchas gracias. ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Ana.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ana y Gonzalo. Bueno, reflexiones muy interesantes sobre una situación tremendamente compleja, claro, a la que nos estamos enfrentando. Muchos actores, muchos equilibrios, todo interconectado, todo interdependiente, hablamos de infraestructuras, hablamos de materiales y todo pues detrás con implicaciones políticas muy relevantes. Yo también me quedo con la última mención que ha hecho Ana y en el artículo que mencionaba sobre la necesidad de realismo como punto de partida para poder buscar unas soluciones más adecuadas, ¿no? para todos. Bueno, pasamos ahora a la siguiente parte del seminario, donde tendremos un debate con participantes igualmente excepcionales, verdaderos expertos en el tema energético en el que nos estamos centrando y específicamente en la zona en la cual hoy nos estamos concentrando. En una conversación que va a ser de nuevo moderada por Gonzalo Escribano. Tengo que decir en primer lugar que hemos acordado que las presentaciones, las introducciones de los ponentes van a ser breves para no robar tiempo al debate, porque además es que podríamos estar toda la mañana teniendo en cuenta la gran experiencia que ellos tienen. Bueno, so let me shift to English for a while. So with this disclaimer in mind, I would like to introduce first to Harry Timitras. Harry is director at Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Cyprus Center, and senior fellow at Atlantic Council. He's an expert in energy security and geopolitics, the law of the sea, foreign policy, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Here with us is also Sovet Karbuts. He is a director of hydrocarbons and energy security division at the Mediterranean Observatory for Energy and Climate. He has worked also for the EIA and in several institutions and companies in different countries as Austria, Germany, and Turkey, of course. And finally, he is with us online is Lori Haitayan. Lori is Middle East and North Africa Director at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. Her activity focuses on the geopolitical dimensions of MENA's energy sector. Unfortunately, due to a last-minute problem, he cannot be physically with us, but yes, thank you, Lori, for your flexibility. We have been able to organize his presence online. Thank you so much for accepting, all of you, our invitation and for being here with us or connected as Lori. And I would like, the last point, to indicate to the audience that all of you can send your questions for those who are connected online through the platform and for those who are here in the room through the cards that the organization has distributed. Thank you, of course, to all that are now attending the seminar also. Nothing more from my side. Gonzalo, please, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Manuel. Como ven ustedes, hoy hago doblete, así que intentaré ser breve. I will move to English. And I will start with Harry, if you agree. And by the way, thank you so much, Laurie from Brussels, for making the effort to be with us. We really appreciate. Harry, I will ask you first, because you are more an expert on the geopolitical dimension, I will ask you to give us kind of overview on the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean region. What's the current geopolitical framework in the region? As usually my president used to say, are geopolitics trumping geoeconomics in the region, or what's your view on that?
Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you very much for the invitation and for hosting him here, and the usual disclaimer on very personal views, and I think you'll see why. When Andrei Gromyko, as foreign minister of the Soviet Union, was asked to describe relations with the West in one word, he said good, and in two words, not good. And unfortunately, that's pretty much the situation in this Mediterranean in two ways. One, I think we need to realize that what's happening in that region is both the outcome of what's happening globally, but reversely, what happens in that region also affects other regions and indeed the global situation. So we had a difficult discussion to start with in geopolitical terms, in economic terms, in terms of relations between the various states, but also within the states. And then things happened. So the first thing that I think needs to be understood is that as an outcome of now Gaza, but also before the war in Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, the first thing is really that there is no such thing as a frozen conflict. I don't think we should be taking anything for granted internationally, because unfortunately we have been doing this for some time. So the geopolitical situation is a direct outcome, as I say, both of conflict in the narrower sense, but also of trends that have been happening in the broader region. You have a set of traditional challenges, if you like, the well-known bilateral problems between Greece and Turkey, the Cyprus issue, obviously the Israel-Palestinian crisis and all. And then on top of this, a new set of challenges were allowed to be built, exactly because we've allowed these disputes to draw so long in time, such as energy issues, on top of which a new layer comes in the form of Syria, in the form of Libya, other conflicts, and on top of which you now have a new layer of a new hot conflict, as you like. So, as I say, we can't take things for granted, either positively or negatively. Nobody perhaps would have seen a year before it happened the very positive developments of the Abraham Accords, the way that Israel came very close to its Arab neighbors, the fact that Lebanon and Israel, two countries that not only don't recognize each other, but are technically in a state of war, managed to sit together, yes, with US mediation, but sat together as a matter of principle to delimit a maritime border. So when there is a will, there is a way. But also nobody would have foreseen the October the 7th events. And so in a sense, I take exactly the lead from what Anna was saying. Realism and pragmatism need to be at the forefront of our minds. I also think that we need to have a sense of urgency, because that seems to be slipping us. And I desperately also think that we need to extend our thinking, to think outside the box, if you like, simply because the box itself has not really led us very far.
Thank you so much, Harry, for this wonderful synthesis. And I will move now to Shobet, who is a great expert on natural gas. That is, as you know, a very significant driver of geopolitics. We don't know if for cooperation or for conflict, or probably for both at the same time in the region. And it's true that a lot has changed in the East Med geopolitics over the last 15 years. There are new alliances, there are new alignments. So my question would be, which role do you see for energy in general and gas in particular in the region? What do you think will be the points that you would like to highlight?
First of all, it's been a great pleasure and honor to be here for that. I thank you very much for the kind invitation. Well, you know, in 15 years, a lot has changed in terms of geopolitics and energy in East Mediterranean region. But when you look at the East Mediterranean region. Normally we talk about gas. So far, the amount of gas that has been discovered in the region is equivalent to the amount of gas discovered in Norway. So it is a huge region in terms of gas amount that is discovered. But when you take into account of the amount of gas that could potentially be discovered, then we would have North Sea, in fact. Whether it will be discovered or not, and if it is discovered, whether it will be put into production capacity, we don't know. But a lot will depend on the geopolitical developments. So what has happened? Harry mentioned a few of them. So, for example, in 2008, the relations of Turkey with Israel started to deteriorate. And also the relations between Turkey and Egypt deteriorated after the ousting of Morsi in 2013. But in the meantime, what we have in 2009, 10, 11, very large discoveries. Leviathan, Tamar, and Aphrodite fields. So more or less coinciding. And in the meantime, so the Turkish relation with Israel and Egypt worsened, and Cyprus and Greece played a very active role. So they had their trilateral meetings with Israel, with Egypt, and with Jordan, with Lebanon, and these trilateral meetings, etc. Gas was also in the center, led to establishment of East Med Gas Forum. And soon afterwards, as Ari mentioned, in August 2020, we have Abraham Accords. What happened is that in Abraham Accords, it was not only political things. Then we saw that the flowing investments of Arab investments even to Israel. Things have been moving. And then in 2021, January, the relations between Gulf Cooperation Council and Qatar has been, normalized. And within these things, of course, Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey were excluded. So a kind of, as you mentioned, new alliances and new alignments have been shaped. But with the starting of normalization effort between Turkey and Egypt and Israel until October, were putting us into more optimistic way. But after that, things have changed again. So I will stop here. Maybe we continue later.
Thank you so much, Sovet. Yeah, that's a very complex and changing situation and very volatile in geopolitical terms. I will now move to Lauri, and Lauri, I hope you can hear me properly.
Yes.
And I would like to go more to the case of Lebanon. That is very few people here in Spain are aware of the very almost tragic energy and poly crisis. In fact, the country is suffering. And I think it's a good case study to start, from going from the regional side to a more individual case for our audience to understand what's going on in your country, but also how this can reverberate in the region. So my question would be, what would you like to explain to us of what's going on in Lebanon in terms of the energy crisis?
Yes, thank you. And first of all, I'm really sorry I couldn't be in person. But at least maybe I contributed to less carbon by not flying, but being here in Brussels and talking to you about our region. So at least this is like something that I contributed. Thank you all. As you said, maybe Lebanon, yes, is one of the Eastern Mediterranean countries. Very interesting. A couple of points that I will highlight that shows a bit maybe the possibilities and the complexities of the region. Within the region and vis-a-vis maybe Europe as well. So Lebanon in 2019 and in mainly 2020 had a full collapse of the country, multiple crises on the economic level, financial level, and currently we see even on a security level. So basically, when all these collapses happen, the weakest link first collapses, and the weakest link already was the power sector in Lebanon, which had suffered years of mismanagement and years of, if we want, let's put it as mismanagement and not go far from that. So basically what happened is like the Lebanese main utility, the Électricité du Liban, EDL, the public utility, was unable to provide electricity anymore to the people. And then even on top of that, the generators, the private generators that would complement usually the lack of electricity, were unable to provide as well because there was lack of money in the country to be able to import and buy the fuel needed. In that situation, one opportunity came up to connect Lebanon to the region, and that was through a project of giving Lebanon gas from Egypt, so transferring gas from Egypt to Lebanon through the Arab pipeline. That is an infrastructure that exists in the region that would cross Egypt to Jordan, to Syria, and then to Lebanon to give electricity through the gas and power stations that run on gas. And the other collaboration or interconnectivity project was for Jordan to provide Lebanon electricity through the grid, again crossing the grids from Syria to Lebanon. These were like two interesting interconnecting projects. However, they faced with political problems internally and externally. So basically, with the gas from Egypt to Lebanon, the main problem were the Caesar Act sanctions that were put on Syria by the US government. Even though this idea of connecting or flowing the Egyptian gas to Lebanon was a US idea and supported by the US government, but the US Treasury had a problem, and they wanted to make sure that this project and this gas that will flow through the pipelines of Syria to Lebanon is not going to support the Assad regime, the Syrian regime. And therefore, the Lebanese had to guarantee that this is not going to support the Assad regime. And on top of that, the Egyptian government wanted guarantees that if the gas flows from Egypt to Lebanon, this is not going to affect Egypt, and that a change in administration in the US will not have an impact on that. So if this is a Democratic-led initiative, if the Republicans come and take over, then maybe the Republicans will use that to punish or to sanction the Egyptian government. And therefore, that was one of the main issues why this project failed and didn't see light, because of the political dimension and the geopolitical dimension of it. On the Jordan and Lebanon failure of that project of linking electricity between Jordan and Syria, Lebanon, it was more beyond the Caesar Act, because for Jordan, they felt more secure that the US, whatever government there is, like Democrats or Republicans, Jordan is very important for the security of the region and for the security of Israel. Therefore, they don't mind much, like they wouldn't be sanctioned. So it wasn't a concern, but more it was an internal concern this time that Lebanon did not fulfill its commitments to the World Bank, and therefore there was no money to link the projects on that. So this is kind of where you can see the opportunities, because mainly that gas project, gas to Lebanon from Egypt, or even the electricity from Jordan to Lebanon, had a component, a very interesting component, which was like, to some extent, that gas or that electricity, some part of it is Israeli gas that is flowing and is Israeli gas that goes into the Jordan market that produces electricity. So indirectly, again, Lebanon and Israel, who are at war, but there might have been this connection through energy. And this is like one of the, if you want, like the absurdity and the beauty and the complexity of the region. I stop here. I can go later on the gas and renewable competition that is happening as well in the region and in Lebanon, but I'll stop here, and I'm ready to answer your other questions, Gonzalo.
Thank you so much, Laurie. We keep on with Larry now, and I will pose you a second question if you agree. We have been talking about many projects in the region. We got this EastMed pipeline, we got these electricity interconnectors, the Euro-Asia, Euro-Africa, with Cyprus connecting to either Egypt or Israel. As Laurie just said, I mean, the current geopolitical situation is much more complex. My question to you, I mean, there are many other projects. My question to you would be, is it possible for you to give us a realistic appraisal of what the situation is and how this can impact, energy needs, which opportunities we can foresee there, what are the main challenges, and which planning do we need to start thinking on in order to address this situation?
Sure. First of all, I think I can top up Laurie's absurdity, saying that now the situation in North Cyprus is such that Israeli interest companies are having construction sites selling to Iranians who live permanently there. So realism is there, and again, maybe business trumps geopolitics. So what you were saying, I think, is right in two senses. One is that there are opportunities perhaps for the EastMed, I knew, after the crisis, especially in Ukraine, because the crisis in the Ukraine war meant both the need for alternative supplies, hence the EastMed again in the picture that was not before, simply because Europe could not have been a destination for gas. And secondly, it highlighted energy security over climate change concerns, at least in the short term, again placing the EastMed in the possible focal point. But at the end of the day, I think we have been very unrealistic and missed a lot of opportunities, especially because it was politics, if you like, political decisions, very rarely with sound grounding on the technical side and the economic side, that allowed for decisions to be made, or more importantly, not to be made, and opportunities missed. And then we ended up in a terrain where we had very problematic cases of exploitation, and even in the successful ones, we could not plan long term. What I mean to say, do you remember the hype over the Zohr field in Egypt? And the Zohr field has been massively underperforming to about a third of what was the projected initial capacity, posing added challenges for Egypt. On top of this, because of the, I don't want to say pharaonic, but at least the grandeur of the projects in Egypt, it means that the massive influx of cash, I understand that there is about 50 billion pumped in through a combined effort of the EBRD, the IAB, the Gulf, and all that, is probably going to be used in different ways rather than directly poured in to the energy infrastructure. making for a really, really tough case in Egypt. That has both economic repercussions and political repercussions. Obviously, Egypt in an extremely dire financial situation with the devaluation of the pound, with massive external debt. They simply have no dollars to spend as such, with exceeding energy needs that will have a political footprint. I remind you that El-Sisi was brought about to a large extent through power shortages and cuts. So cuts brought him, cuts have the capacity to take him away. So obviously the political card is played. But this political card is played very intensely also by the forces abroad. Israel is extremely keen on the maintenance of the regime in Egypt for its own political purposes. Europe the same, because obviously uncertainty is not in the DNA of the European Union and Europe in general, but also because simply the fact is that other issues are in play, like migration, and not only in the sense that Egypt is keeping at bay millions and millions of potential migrants to Europe, those 6 million of people around Lake Chad, others and all, but also because of potential Egyptians doing so. If I understand it correctly, Egypt, in order to keep things as they are, without improvement but with no deterioration, need to be creating 1 million new jobs per year for its youth. And I don't think this is very likely. So obviously these migrants are potentially migrants to Europe, and hence Europe has a great interest in keeping things at bay. That's the negative part. The positive part is that I think the amount of of energy found in the region, can be used for local consumption and address the local needs of the whole region, and that I think would be fantastic. Secondly, the future of the region is most probably interconnectivity and electrification, hence the cables you talk about, if we don't screw up politically on them, as we have been wonderfully doing with gas until now through disagreements between the countries. And thirdly, by giving, I think, different messages to the ones we've been giving until now. I refer specifically to the European Union that has been giving, to my mind, mixed messages until now. You can't have the organs like the EBRD and EIB having stopped legally funding anything on fossil fuels, and at the same time the European Commission funding with seed funding the EastMed potential gas pipeline or gas pipe dream, whatever you name it. These are mixed messages that really do not help. We need to have a concise, coherent effort on the part of the EU, because fortunately or unfortunately, what comes out of the EU in that region is taken in a metaphysical quality. If it comes from the EU, then it's nearly given to us on plaques from abroad. And so there is added responsibility, I think, we need to have.
Thank you, Harry. I turn now to Shobet. In your previous intervention, you just stopped before the October the 7th, events in Israel and the subsequent crisis and Israeli attacks on Gaza. My question now would be, could you please help us to understand what has been the impact of this Gaza crisis on the regional energy dynamics?
Let's focus a few countries first and then look at the regional implications. The biggest loser is Gaza, because we are back to square one in terms of the development of Gaza Marine Field. As you know, this Gaza Marine Field, 40 billion cubic meters, not too much maybe, but was discovered 25 years ago. And there were several attempts to develop the field, etc. Israel never allowed. But last year, in June 2023, Israeli government officially announced that they are giving green light for the development of this gas field. And Egyptian state-owned gas company, EGAS, and a private company were supposed to start physically developing the field end of October. And the field was supposed to be start producing early 2024. And just a few weeks before the physical work started, we know what happened. So the future of the field, God knows. No, again, we will wait maybe another 25 years. Egypt, Harry mentioned a lot. Economy is doing very bad. Currency devaluations, problems everywhere in the neighborhood. $57 billion have been secured. Well, Harry was very political. $24 billion of which will be invested to create a tourism city in the Mediterranean. So investments need to be done wisely. Suez Canal revenues, also Anna mentioned, etc. But let's look at energy. Finally, after the discovery of Zohr and some other quite significant, important fields, Egypt finally became an LNG exporter, even a net gas exporter. But today, the natural LNG exports 3 cargoes in January, 2 cargoes February, 1 cargo March, 0 cargo in April. Actually, in April, they already imported a cargo. And they now rented an FSRU, regasification floating ship, to import LNG between June and October. So they need to invest so that they can produce and satisfy demand. And the plans of getting more gas from Israel is not doing well, because now we move to Israel. Several projects have been delayed. That was with the purpose to increase the production capacity in Leviathan and Tamar, and increase the connections or increase the capacity of in Israel some pipelines, and also increase the export capacity to Egypt. These have been delayed, but it doesn't mean that it will stop. Instead of 2024, they will be delayed in 1 year, maybe 1.5 years. But because of these issues, the floating LNG export project is put on hold for the moment. And one other thing for Israel was important was that a year ago, in March 2023, United Arab Emirates company, ADNOC, and BP put a deal to take 50% of NewMed Energy, Israeli company. 2 days ago, there was an investor relations news from NewMed Energy. It says ADNOC's 50% NewMed Energy take has been indefinitely suspended. So this is one thing. But Mubadala, another UAE company, owns 10% stake in Tamar. There is no talk on that. So for Israel, the impact just for delaying of projects, and maybe also in upstream projects. And pipeline capacity increases. When we look at the regional parts, just in a few words, there were some efforts to increase electricity interconnections in the region. Those probably will be delayed. And one more thing that will be probably suspended is the agreement between UAE, Jordan, and Israel on water for electricity deal. And renewable energy, we talked, maybe this will be delayed too, because the investors would like to have a secure environment to operate. So, who is the winner? Everyone is loser. Some are big losers, some are small losers. I don't know, but arguably could be a country who's having war now in Ukraine.
Okay, that's very clear. Regarding the Gaza crisis and Gaza being the main loser, we have to remember that Gaza itself has been suffering from an energy crisis for years now. I mean, even before the events, lights were out more than half of the day. And this has led to a huge increase in renewable energies, in fact, to solar panels. I mean, because many Gazans, they couldn't rely either on the horrible management of the Hamas government in terms of energy. It has been a mess. These are my words. But also, they couldn't rely on electricity being sent by Israel. So this population has developed a lot of solar panels, and there was this momentum thinking, oh, finally, renewables got a place in supporting peace, on giving more autonomy, strategic autonomy, as we call it in the European Union. But then October the 7th came, and all these solar panels that we, with our cooperation funds, have been helping to build in hospitals or houses or facilities, have been destroyed. So this led us to this naive approach that renewables will bring peace in somehow. It depends on the geopolitical setting very much. With that, trying to link this with this relation between renewables and introducing renewables and competition between renewables and gas in the region that has been already mentioned, I would like to ask to you, Lauri, if you agree on that, how do you see this coexistence, competition, complementarity between renewables and gas in the region? How this influence the subject of our meeting today? In how can geopolitics influence the transition pathways of the region?
Yes, definitely. And before I go to that, just like one again, like a positive note for the region, so that it's not, you don't go after this like with like doomsday and everything is black. So I guess like to talk about energy and what's happening in the region, it's clear by now that there is a red line, which is like not to attack energy installments or any kind of gas platforms, etc., by all parties, being it like Israelis, Iranians, their proxies, and the US. So that is very clear, because whatever happens and any attacks on any kind of assets that have to do with the supply of energy could affect the global energy prices. And looking at what we're seeing, no one wants to see like a price of oil going up to $100 or more, because we think we're getting out of recession or economic slowdown, so we don't want that. So that's why we see that even when Israel is attacking Iran, is not going after the gas or oil. The same for the Red Sea attacks. They're not targeting directly the oil tankers, etc. They're doing something else. Even inside like where Lebanon is involved in the war, they have not threatened the Karish platform. And Karish platform is an Israeli gas field that is very close to the Lebanese borders, and there might be under attack by Hezbollah, which has the capacities to attack them, but never that had been threatened during all the 6 months. The same, even when Tamar closed down early on, there were no direct attacks on Tamar, but it was a preventive action by the Israelis to close down the Tamar field. And they closed it for almost a month. And automatically, more than having an effect on Israel, it affected Egypt. And that's why they had to come back. And on that note as well, Egypt and Israel's flows of gas are still continuing. Even when the tensions are at the highest, the gas never stopped flowing from Israel to Egypt, and the same from Israel to Jordan, even though they are at the peak, at the highest of this agreement when it comes to the the military activities in Gaza. So therefore, that's very important to understand as well. The interconnectivity in the region, when it exists, it does create stability. So this interconnectivity that exists today through energy between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, it is still standing. Yes, definitely the other project, which was the renewable versus water project, which was linking like Jordan to Israel. So Jordan gives renewable electricity because it has the space to put the power, the renewable plants, the solar plants. In exchange, Israel gives what Jordan needs, which is water, and that all was sponsored by UAE money. Anyway, that project hadn't started yet. So we cannot say that it was stopped because of the war. Anyway, there were other problems with that. But saying that, these kind of interconnectivity definitely will bring stability, even though the region looks crazy. So to go back to your question quickly about this competition between gas and renewables, definitely in the Eastern Mediterranean, the only two countries that have gas discoveries and exploitation and using it is Egypt and Israel. Israel has more capacities to be able to export within the region and even outside the region through the infrastructure that exists in Egypt, which is like through the LNG terminals. At the same time, Turkey has found, not in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Black Sea, definitely discoveries that will help its own needs. But Lebanon, no gas discoveries. Same for Syria. And Cyprus has discoveries, but unable to develop it for different reasons that we don't want to go into it. But there was this very political hype by all political parties in all these Eastern Mediterranean countries about gas. And on that made them kind of like preferring to develop the gas fields on finding alternatives to powering their the electricity needs that they have. But anyway, most of them, none in the region has a target of 100% of use of renewable in the energy mix. I guess like because of technical reasons, and definitely because they still want to focus on gas, because in the region they feel that gas gives you political leverage and gives you income as well, revenues that they are in need for. So that's one aspect to it. The renewable energy, definitely today we're seeing that there is a surge in renewables, and it is becoming more and more competitive because the money is there. The financing of renewables is something of interest to the Europeans or other agencies more than the gas. And this is where we are seeing that now countries are more interested in renewable projects to get that kind of investment coming in. That will help the economies as well, because don't forget that many of the countries in the region are facing economic hardship. So it's not always out of necessity of conviction that we need to save the planet as it is in the EU, but it is more about different other reasons than saving the planet. And this is something I think that I would stop here, not go much, but like a message about the EU vis-a-vis Eastern Mediterranean or even North Africa. You cannot go with the Eurocentric vision of the energy transition. Many of our countries face hardships, and their interest in transitioning are for different reasons than saving the planet. And just like to make sure, and on that point again, like just to put it in the context, when we say that, it's like when you look at the region, so you see that you have on the North Africa, which is like closer to Spain, Algeria and Morocco, there's a Cold War there. Tunisia and Egypt, they're struggling economically, and Libya is in chaos. So, and Algeria depends much on revenues from gas, and Morocco is trying to position itself as the leader when it comes to renewables and to hydrogen. So these are important incentives for Tunisia and for Egypt. The economic incentive of getting money into the country is more important than the renewable projects in themselves. And then you have on our side the Eastern Mediterranean, as I said, because Egypt sometimes we put it in the Western Mediterranean, and sometimes we put it with us, depending on what we're trying to achieve. So again, as I said, there is a big struggle in economy, but at the same time, there's a big struggle in the internal energy consumption, and they need all sorts of energy to be able to get to their people's consumption. Israel and Palestine today, even though it's tragic, but there is an opportunity. Gonzalo, when you say that everything has been destroyed, everything could be built the right way as well. And this is how we see it. As I said, Lebanon has a total collapse, and people are putting renewables as personal initiatives. We don't have large-scale projects because we cannot attract the money because of the failure of the banking system and the financial system, and there is no guarantee through the IMF. Syria is at war, and the Cyprus problem is where I will stop there, because for me, and I'm not an expert of Cyprus, but I really see potential for Cyprus. Cyprus could become the land of energy, the island of energy, and the island of peace, and it could play an important role in shaping the future of our region. Very quick, I keep on saying very quick, I'm sorry for that, but we, through other colleagues of mine, we developed this idea of gas and renewables can coexist in the island, through the Greek part and the Turkish part, to provide electricity to Turkey, to Greece, to the region, us, and to Europe. So once you're in Greece, you're in Europe, and Cyprus is Europe. So that's an important to transform the island, instead of being a separated island, into an energy island. On top of that, peace island, because this is where Israelis and Palestinians and Turkish and Greek and others could meet in buffer zones to discuss about the future of the region. So Cyprus is very crucial. We have to think about it that way, and I stop there.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for giving us some reasons for a more constructive approach. I totally agree with you that we have to save some pessimism for better times. So now, perhaps what could be interesting, Harry, is, we have been talking of several issues, you mentioned migration, there is security, there is climate that has played a significant role. Last summer, the horrible heat wave that affected all the region has a significant impact on the blackouts in Egypt, on the chaos in Gaza, on the Lebanon crisis, and so on and so forth. So it will be really helpful for us if you can help in connecting the dots of all these different dimensions that are being mentioned in the region.
Sure, gladly. Let me first build on exactly what Laurie was saying. The positive is that renewables for this region in particular, and for any region in trouble and conflict, are perhaps the way out, in the sense that renewables are not commodities like gas that countries feel obliged to fight over. The value added lies in the usage in common if and when the states wish. By way of example, there is an electrical interconnection between Greece and Turkey. Very few people know about it, even few talk about it, but it's there, and it operates irrespective of the problems in principle. So again, pragmatism trumps things. But let's do this, connect the dots. I think we're missing very direly on this in providing threading, if you like. We desperately need to connect the dots in two ways. One, geographical, second, thematic. In a sense, geographical, because what happens in the West Med, just to take one example, affects very directly, but also indirectly, the East Med and vice versa. What's happening in Egypt now, for instance, but beyond, the Houthis. Who thought in the past that they would have to get security clearance from the Houthis? We never knew who the Houthis were to get anything through the Red Sea to Egypt. Insurance prices have hit the ceiling. So obviously it very much affects the situation. It's an important discussion that we're having here in Spain on Morocco and Algeria and other places, but I don't think we can leave out the East Med, and we desperately need to connect geographical threading. The second thread that needs to be connected by way of dots is the thematic one. What happens in climate affects migration, which affects energy, which affects security. And so although we have very, very good discussions in each of these subjects very often, I don't really see usually a connection between them. Look at what's happening just climatically in the region, which, by the way, according to the UN, is one of the top regions of climate energy, climate challenge-wise on the planet. The climate is basically a threat multiplier through the droughts that you explained, the food security issues, the evaporation increase, temperature, and all that. This will lead to certain areas being uninhabitable. It will lead to domestic migration. In Egypt already, this is a great problem. To cities that the municipal infrastructure simply cannot take it, which desperately will need then to have external migration. And that migration is directly connected to energy needs. And so I don't think we always connect the dots, and I would suggest that we do so. Secondly, combined with this, we need to go 30,000 feet up and have a helicopter view of not only the region, but also perhaps more globally. What we discussed today stands for today. If the Trump administration comes in the United States in November, the projection is that the footprint of the US is going to be to add 4 billion tons of emissions until 2030. That is equivalent to the annual emissions of all of the EU and Japan together, or the equivalent of 140 of the lowest countries emission-wise on the planet annually. It will add at least $1 trillion of climate damage, and of course it would mean that the US is missing its targets. Instead of 52%, it will be up to 28%. So we need to think globally, because that will affect us in this region very directly. The risk, both the physical risk, the security risk of transportation, of production, is heightened in this region. Risk companies are more averse to risk, obviously banks and the funding and all this. So I think we're going to be presented with a series of physical challenges, security challenges, financial challenges. The transition is wonderful, but transition will cost a few trillion, and I don't know where this money will come from in an era of extreme financial hardship otherwise. And a final point, if I may, just to build on what Sohbet was saying. It's not that the war in Ukraine led Europe to seek alternative supplies. It also meant that Russia has secured alternative markets, because it's not as if Russian energy just disappeared. It just moved from over the table to under the table to unregulated. So 28 new contracts with African countries. So obviously it's there. Obviously we're going to find it ahead of us. And I'm very much for pragmatism. I'm not going to mention a country that just received an LNG shipment from Russia. But this is important. Yes, I understand. But I'm not saying give it up, but need to do it in a regulated way that will eventually combine the overall vision, if you like, with the way of attaining the target, hopefully today.
Excellent, Harry. Yeah, it's true that seems that Russia has been much more successful in diversifying us than the European Union has been in diversifying from Russia. Let's now, Sovet, if you agree, to look a bit to the future. What are the prospects? How do you see, what can happen in the coming years? And if you can, make us what will be the spectrum between the optimistic scenarios and the more pessimistic one. Which are the options that we are facing in the region regarding energy geopolitics?
Yeah. You may agree or not, but in my view, energy is the only denominator that brings all the countries in the region together. They all need it. But energy, I put in general. Well, arguably, electricity, for example, is the most important form of energy. If there is no electricity now, the life would stop. No? We could not hold this. Lori would be sitting on her desk, and nobody is more or less carrying cash. No, you cannot take cash. Life would stop. So we need electricity, but you produce it from fossil fuels or not, this is another thing. The region has both, as I said, in terms of undiscovered and discovered resource potential, there is huge potential gas, but there is huge potential of solar and wind, that you can produce electricity instead of having blackouts today. So energy is important, but natural gas so far have shaped even the politics. But definition of natural gas is changing too. Today, in Europe, for example, we don't talk about natural gas anymore. We say gaseous fuels. What is gaseous fuels? Natural gas, biogas, biomethane, and hydrogen, which is at the end is gas anyway, hydrogen gas. So when we look at the region again, okay, natural gas is fossil gas is there, but biomethane, biogas is not discussed at all. Why? Because there is no technology, there is no investment, etc. So how to develop so that, energy is an indicator of development. When you look at the electricity consumption per capita, GDP per capita, it is nearly parallel. Energy consumption or GDP goes parallel. You have to consume energy. So the region has the energy, but we need enablers. What are the enablers? Well, having an attractive investment climate. So physical security and also political and geopolitical security. Then the people or the companies would come and invest. And maybe not only for EastMed, but the Mediterranean in general, which we at OMEC propose, we need a Mediterranean Green Deal. So it is not, copying the European Green Deal, but with its own originalities. We need a Mediterranean Green Deal. But how do you do all these things? Is that this is a problematic region, East Mediterranean. So these alliances don't work. We need to be pragmatic. We need to create a joint projects, joint development mechanism. For example, joint exploration projects, because of the Cyprus issue, etc., because maritime borders in the region is not determined. Joint infrastructure projects, even creating a virtual hub. Why not, as Larry said, Cyprus could be a bridge. Why not in Cyprus? But how do you do all this complicated thing? Is that we need a mechanism. What is the mechanism? We have a mechanism, for example, EastMed Gas Forum, an intergovernmental organization or international organization. It doesn't work. I mean, for the press, it doesn't work. You can delete it because I'm representing OMED in EastMed Gas Forum Gas Industry Advisory Committee. EastMed Gas Forum, but in fact, maybe it should be renamed. EastMed Energy and Climate Forum, something like this, because we are not talking about gas anymore. We have to go beyond. But as mentioned before, Turkey, Northern Cyprus, Lebanon, Syria is not there. So you cannot do anything in East Mediterranean as an international body. No. We need a non-governmental forum. I don't know, just come to my mind. For example, you guys, bringing academics, even government officials, industry together from all countries. So far, there is no place that could bring all these actors and discuss these issues. So there is no other way than cooperation and collaboration, but even for that, we need a place. And
Plus
that place
we can cooperate with OMEC on that.
Why not?
Okay, thank you so much. I move now to Lauri, and I'm going to start. I have already received some questions, so I'm going to start to introduce some of the questions. Lauri, if you agree. This question I think is very fit for you because, you work in a resource-oriented governance institute. There are some questions on how can we improve energy governance in the region? There is another question on to what extent fossil subsidies in the region are preventing deployment of renewables. And another one is how is, you mentioned before, they said, yes, you have mentioned mismanagement of resources. Where are we at that point and what can we do? By the way, there are other questions that I already advanced to you on the role of the European Union, that you just alluded to it, on the future of Israel-Iran tensions, and others. So I start to introduce them in order for you, if you want to address any of them. So, Lauri, whenever you want.
Yes, thank you. So you gave me the hardest questions, which are more about internal dynamics, country dynamics. So definitely there is no one governance for the region, as we of course understand. It's country by country. But what to say on the subsidy and governance issue? Very important. It's at least I can speak on behalf. Not on behalf, but what I will say maybe applies to the Arab Mediterranean countries. A social contract has been built on the government providing services, subsidized services, to the people. And one of these services is the energy and electricity. So what you see today, when you are saying that me as a country, I am able to give you almost cheapest electricity possible because I'm subsidizing it for different reasons. I can afford or I cannot afford, but this is the social contract. Today, under the energy transition, we need to move into another sort of generation, which is through the renewables that might cost you more. So now the governments have to tell their people that we are changing the social contract. We are going to make you pay more. And then the people will be like, okay, so then what do I get in return? And that's the core and the beauty of the complexities of the region about the social contract and how to redefine social contract between the citizens and the political elite in the countries, from Morocco to Algeria, to Tunisia, to Libya, to Egypt, to Israel, to Palestine, to Lebanon, to Cyprus, to Syria. All of that, it's mainly, most of them, they have to redefine the social contract on this. So the energy transition is opening up discussions that I'm not sure that a lot of countries are interested in opening up because of different situations, security, and not being able to do it because they don't have the capacities, all of that. But these are issues that need to be understood from the European Union, needs to be understood from the US, so that global north needs to understand like the complexities that come into the energy transition. It's not about switching from gas or heavy fuel oil or coal to renewables. It's deeper than that. Definitely subsidies are one main barrier because, as I said, then how to make it competitive. The second issue is about the private sector. Again, private sector competitiveness is important. It is important for the governments to allow private sector to thrive and to be able to work on that power generation. If you only want to talk about now electricity as energy transition, about electricity sector and not the other, or power sector and not the others, because of course we all understand energy transition is beyond just like the power sector. But if we want to, and then that's important because again, structurally, these issues were built around the government utilities and the public utilities and the public investment. Now there is a need for the private investment, and here comes the complexities about the private competing with the public, and that is not easy as well. What is the main problem in Egypt today? It's because the military has control over the economy, which doesn't allow for the private sector to thrive, and this is where we're seeing the problems of lack of dollars, or shortage of dollars, or shortage of direct investments that are that country needs to grow the economy. So I stop here. I'm sure I didn't answer everything, but like at least this is like a flavor of what's happening in the region.
Thanks a lot, Laurie. We still have 8 minutes, and I will select 2 questions. The first one is which role for the EU, what the EU should do, and the second is about where are we in energy reform, and what are the needs for energy reform in the region. So if you can have 3 minutes each, that would be great, and then we go for the conclusions. Who wants to start? You want to start?
Please.
Go for it.
Thanks. First of all, I'm going to challenge Sohbet. You don't need electricity to transfer money. Russian money in Cyprus went from south to the north in bags because of the sanctions. So that's fine. Secondly, I very much agree on rethinking the arrangements like the East Med Gas Forum to East Med Energy Forum. I think that's extremely important because, look, I've said this before, but cooperation is like cholesterol. You can have good cooperation and bad cooperation. If cooperation is designed or ends up in being exclusionary, then it's going to be short-lived. And I think the East Med Gas Forum started on a bad foot. That leads into the discussion on the EU. Part of the problem is that the EU, but not only the EU to be fair, others, have been looking at the region in a fragmented way. And I would suggest that we need, as I said, go a little bit up, look at the whole region, have holistic solutions that bring in financial aspects to geopolitical aspects, various aligning member states, individual member states' interest to the EU, because unfortunately we can't really speak with an EU or Brussels voice if member states, depending on the case, have different agendas to be diplomatic about it. But the EU institutionally, to be a little harsher on the EU, the EU both needs to have a less myopic and more coherent view on this. But let's start with cooperating within the EU institutions. Just to take one example, you have a fantastic discussion at DG NEAR until you reach the crux, and they say, yes, but you need to take this up with DG Energy. And as long as you do that, yes, but you need to have the discussion with External Action. So I think we need to have also coherency on the part of the EU and have a realistic take, as I say. We also need to have, I think, a very honest discussion with Turkey, because like it or not, from realistic point of view, Turkey is there. Turkey will Turkey, pardon, will probably remain there. So we need to have an honest discussion rather than pretending we do. And then I think the last thing would be to have, if you like, a global view in the sense that, look, we have a Eurocentric view and sometimes we have an EU-centric view, but Europe accounts for 8% of global energy consumption. The problem is elsewhere. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a very clean EU in the sense of a luxury cabin in a sinking boat. We need to have global solutions. If India and China, together they're about 3 billion, half of the world, if they want to advance their living standards as they have declared by 30%, I don't want to know what the energy consumption needs will be. So let's again try to be a little bit less Eurocentric, putting our house in order first, but try to be pragmatic in the sense that both the problems and the solutions, I think, need to be global.
So, but anything you want to in 2 minutes would be possible?
I fully agree, but I would expand it not to Eurocentric, but Western-centric. You know, the all East Mediterranean, North Africa is global South. When we look at all these energy and climate issues, they are kind of dictated by global North, which has 1 billion population. And the rest, 7 billion population, this global North, is trying to dictate the policies, what the other 7 billion people should do. And it goes even beyond, now because of methane emissions, etc., like World Economic Forum says, eat bugs. You know, how the message is communicated is very, very important. You cannot exclude 7 billion people, some of which are sitting on, for example, in Africa, in many places in Africa, some of which are sitting on natural gas and oil reserves, and you do not give any financing for developing these reserves because of climate consideration. But in the EU, you can build 3-4 FSRUs in Germany, for example, immediately, and all the NGOs are not heard at all. But the same NGOs were applauding and celebrating when this MidCat project between Spain and France was stopped. No, we should be really pragmatic, realistic, and listen what this global South think. Because those people, okay, they need to use their energy resources, fossil fuel or not. It is better to develop together with fossil fuel all the existing renewable resources, but we need pragmatism. So the North is not much cleverer than the South.
Lauri, you got the last 2 minutes.
Oh my God. Okay. So in 2 minutes, what I could say is like, I do believe in interconnectivity and in collaboration and cooperation. Interconnectivity within the region, from North Africa to the Levant to the GCC countries, and with Europe. Europe is our neighborhood, and yes, maybe they live in La La Land, but I think like a lot of our countries would like to be in La La Land as well. So there is a lot of connectivity and a lot of work to be done. It's important, as my colleagues had said, to hear what we have to say and to hear for the EU as well concern. It's like two-way concern, but and to work and collaborate together on energy projects. So that's what I can say in less than 2 minutes, I guess.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you. It was very, very interesting. I will keep talking for many more time, but that will be the next time. And well, going from La La Land to Naturgy Land, this is now the time I will
hope that you will join me in saying thank you and clapping a lot for our speakers. Thank you so much to you all.
Okay, thank you. You all. Really interesting debate with different approaches to the problem, which, as you said, is really with a high level of complexity. Based on your comments, I only would like to say that perhaps let's hope that the energy sectors could help to solve or to ease the problems in the area. Of course, taking into account that the political issues are there playing the main role, but perhaps all this cooperation or these commitments that you mentioned perhaps could help. Muchas gracias a todos por la asistencia. Creo que el objetivo que nos marcamos el Real Instituto Elcano y Fundación Naturi de promover el debate y de intentar explicar lo que está pasando en otras zonas del mundo y que afectan sin duda alguna a nosotros, especialmente en este caso, pues está más que cumplido gracias al gran conocimiento de todos los expertos. Espero que hayan disfrutado y nos vemos en la próxima sesión. Muchas gracias.